The acceptance letter to Harvard lay crumpled in the trash beside 17 others. While somewhere in the mansion's depths, a woman who'd never seen the inside of a college classroom held the one secret that could change everything. Daniel Montgomery III stood at his bedroom window, watching his father's helicopter disappear into the California morning haze. 22 years old, and he couldn't pass a single college entrance exam. Not one. The Princeton rejection still stung the most, his father's alma mater, where 3 generations of Montgomery men had walked before him. Now the Montgomery legacy would die with Daniel's spectacular failures. His phone buzzed. Another text from his father: "Tutor arrives at 2. Don't disappoint me again." Daniel hurled the phone across his room, watching it crack against the Italian marble fireplace. The sound echoed through the 15,000-square-foot estate, but no one came running. They never did anymore. The staff had learned to ignore his outbursts. Just another spoiled rich kid having another tantrum. He caught his reflection in the mirror, hollow eyes. Designer stubble that couldn't hide the boyish face everyone said was too soft for business. His father's words from last night still burned. "You're an embarrassment to the Montgomery name. I've given you every advantage, every opportunity, and you've failed at all of them. The worst part." His father was right. 3 floors below, Grace Williams hummed softly as she folded laundry in the service quarters. At 57, her hands moved with the efficiency of someone who'd been working since childhood, but her dark eyes held a sharpness that decades of being overlooked couldn't dull. She'd been cleaning the Montgomery estate for 8 years, invisible to most of the family, just another piece of expensive furniture. But Grace saw everything. She'd watched Daniel grow from a bright-eyed 14-year-old into this broken young man who barely left his room. She'd quietly collected his crumpled test papers, his torn acceptance letters, his angry journal entries left scattered across his desk. Each failure told her more about his potential than his family ever recognized. Her own son Jerome would have been Daniel's age now, if the cancer hadn't taken him at 17. Jerome, who'd devoured every book Grace brought home from the library's discard pile. Jerome, who'd scored perfect on every practice test they could afford, who'd dreamed of becoming a doctor. Jerome, whose acceptance letter to UCLA had arrived 3 days after his funeral. Grace folded Daniel's Harvard rejection letter, smoothing out the wrinkles with gentle fingers. She'd seen this letter before, in different forms, addressed to different names. She knew the weight of dreams deferred, of potential trapped behind walls too high to climb alone. A crash echoed from upstairs, something expensive meeting an expensive floor. Grace didn't flinch. She'd been expecting it. The new tutor would arrive soon, another in a long line of credentials and condescension, another expert who would fail to see what she saw. The boy wasn't stupid. Grace had listened to him practice presentations, had overheard his late-night phone calls where he explained complex business concepts to friends. She'd watched him solve puzzles that stumped adults, seen him fix mechanical problems that baffled the estate's maintenance crew. But the moment he sat for a formal test, something inside him shut down completely. Grace understood that shutdown. She'd felt it herself in the handful of night school classes she'd attempted years ago, when professors looked right through her, when classmates whispered about affirmative action and charity cases. The fear of not belonging, of confirming every stereotype, could paralyze a brilliant mind faster than any actual ignorance. Her phone chimed a text from Mrs. Montgomery's assistant. The family was extending their European trip another month. Grace almost smiled. Perfect timing. She climbed the servants' stairs, listening to Daniel's frustrated pacing above. At his door, she knocked 3 soft taps. The same pattern she'd used with Jerome when he was struggling with homework. "Go away." Daniel's voice cracked with exhaustion. "I brought you something," Grace said quietly. Silence, then footsteps. Reluctant and heavy. The door opened to reveal Daniel's red-rimmed eyes. His hair disheveled from running anxious fingers through it. "I don't need anything." "Grace, thank you," but she held up a simple composition notebook. Its black and white cover worn soft at the edges. "This belonged to my son." Daniel's protest died in his throat. Grace had worked for his family for 8 years, but he knew almost nothing about her personal life. She existed in his world like air, essential but unnoticed. "Your son, Jerome. He would have been your age." Grace's voice remained steady, but Daniel caught the slight tremor in her hands. "He had the same problem you do. I doubt your son had to deal with the Montgomery expectations." Grace met his eyes directly. Something that made most of the family uncomfortable but somehow felt right with Daniel. He had to deal with something harder. He had to prove he deserved a chance at all. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. Daniel stared at the notebook, and for a moment, Grace saw the lost 14-year-old she remembered. The boy who used to sneak into the library when he thought no one was looking. The tutor arrives in an hour, he said finally. I know. Grace held out the notebook. Maybe after the tutor leaves, you'd like to see what Jerome figured out. Their fingers brushed as he took the notebook, and something passed between them, recognition, maybe, or possibility. Neither could name it yet, but both felt the shift. The first crack in walls that had taken years to build. The tutor arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, briefcase in hand and credentials trailing behind him like expensive cologne. Dr. Harrison Whitfield, Harvard Ph.D. Author of 3 books on accelerated learning, consultant to Fortune 500 CEOs. He charged $500 an hour and had never met a student he couldn't fix, until Daniel, Grace, watched from the hallway as Dr. Whitfield spread his materials across the dining room table. Practice tests, flashcards, intimidating textbooks that seemed to multiply before Daniel's eyes. She'd seen this scene play out dozens of times with different faces, different methods. Always the same result. Let's start with a diagnostic assessment, Dr. Whitfield announced, sliding a thick packet toward Daniel. Standardized format, time limits strictly enforced. This will help me identify your specific learning deficiencies. Daniel's shoulders tensed at the word deficiencies. Grace saw his hands begin to tremble, barely visible. But she'd learned to read the signs. The boy was already shutting down, retreating to that place where anxiety lived like a caged animal. I've reviewed your previous test scores, Dr. Whitfield continued, consulting his tablet. Frankly, they're quite concerning for someone of your background. With your advantages, there's no excuse for being stupid. Daniel's voice was flat, resigned. I didn't say stupid. I said underperforming. Dr. Whitfield's tone carried the patient condescension of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult clients. Now, you have 90 minutes. Begin. Grace retreated to the kitchen, but she could feel the disaster unfolding through the walls. 20 minutes later, she heard the chair scrape back, heard Daniel's footsteps thundering toward the stairs. Dr. Whitfield emerged from the dining room, shaking his head. He didn't even attempt half the questions. Just sat there staring at the paper. I've seen test anxiety, but this is something else entirely. Maybe he needs a different approach, Grace said quietly, surprised by her own boldness. Dr. Whitfield barely glanced at her. With respect, this requires professional expertise. The boy has deep-seated psychological blocks that make him human, Grace interrupted, her voice still soft but carrying an edge that made the tutor actually look at her. Excuse me. Grace felt Jerome's notebook in her apron pocket, felt the weight of 8 years watching this brilliant boy destroy himself with fear. Nothing, sir. I'll clean up the materials. Dr. Whitfield gathered his briefcase, already composing his report for Daniel's father. Another failure to add to the collection, another expert stumped by the Montgomery-heirs' mysterious inability to perform. After he left, Grace found Daniel on the back terrace, staring out at the manicured gardens his mother had designed but never enjoyed. His face was blank, the expression of someone who'd stopped expecting anything different. He's going to tell my father I'm hopeless, Daniel said without looking at her. Are you? The question caught him off guard. Grace wasn't like the other staff. She didn't offer empty reassurances or treat him like fragile crystal. She asked real questions and seemed to actually want real answers. I don't know anymore. Daniel's voice cracked. Maybe I am. Maybe all those tutors and teachers and counselors are right. Maybe I'm just broken. Grace sat down beside him on the stone steps, something that would have scandalized Mrs. Montgomery if she'd been home. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the afternoon light filter through the olive trees. You want to know what Jerome's secret was? Grace asked finally. Daniel nodded, not trusting his voice. Grace pulled out the worn notebook, opening it to a page covered in Jerem's careful handwriting. But instead of notes or formulas, Daniel saw something unexpected: a story. About a young man who lived in a tower made of glass, where everyone could see him but no one could truly reach him. He wrote stories? Daniel asked. Before every test. Before every big exam. He'd write about the fear first, give it a shape, a name, a story. Make it something outside himself instead of something inside eating him alive. She turned the page, and Daniel saw test questions worked out in the margins of another story. This one about a boy who had to solve riddles to save his village. The math problems weren't just equations anymore, they were part of a narrative, part of something meaningful. Jerome had test anxiety too, Grace continued. Worse than yours, probably. The pressure of being the first in our family to go to college, of carrying everyone's dreams on his shoulders. She paused, touching the edge of the notebook. He figured out that his brain worked differently when it had a story to hold onto. Daniel stared at the pages, seeing test prep like he'd never seen it before. The tutors always tell me to eliminate distractions, focus on the facts, clear my mind of everything else. Maybe your mind doesn't want to be cleared. Maybe it wants to be filled with something that matters. Grace turned to another page, where Jerome had transformed a history essay into a letter from a Civil War soldier to his family. The facts were all their dates, battles, political implications, but wrapped in humanity, in story, in connection. This is brilliant, Daniel whispered. And Grace heard something in his voice she hadn't heard in years. Wonder. He got into UCLA with that essay. Grace's voice was quiet, heavy with pride and loss. Full scholarship. Pre-med program. Daniel looked up at her, really looked at her for the first time. Why are you showing me this? Grace closed the notebook carefully, but left it in Daniel's hands. Because Jerome believed that everyone has their own way of being smart. He just had to find his way first. She stood, smoothing her uniform. And because I think you might have the same kind of mind he did. The words hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to build. Grace, who'd spent 8 years being invisible, had just seen Daniel more clearly than anyone in his life. And Daniel, who'd spent years believing he was broken, was holding evidence that maybe broken and different weren't the same thing. Grace, he called as she reached the terrace door. She turned back, and in her eyes, he saw something that had been missing from every tutor, every teacher, every expert who'd tried to fix him. She saw something worth saving. Could you help me understand how this works? Grace smiled, the first real smile Daniel had seen from her in all the years she'd worked for his family. Tomorrow, she said, after the house is quiet, bring a story you want to tell. As the sun set over the Montgomery estate, something shifted in the air between the billionaire's son and the maid who held secrets worth more than his father's fortune. Neither knew it yet. But they'd just taken the first step toward rewriting both their stories. The next morning arrived with a text from Daniel's father that shattered the fragile hope from the night before. Dr. Whitfield's report was devastating. You're clearly not college material. I'm arranging a position at the company mailroom. At least there you can't embarrass the family name. Daniel stared at the message, feeling the familiar weight of failure settle over him like a lead blanket. The mailroom. 22 years old. Heir to $1 billion empire. And his father wanted him sorting letters with the high school dropouts. He looked at Jerem's notebook on his nightstand, and suddenly it seemed naive, childish. What had he been thinking? That stories would magically transform him into someone worthy of the Montgomery name? That a maid's dead son held the key to fixing 8 years of failure? Grace found him in the breakfast room, pushing eggs around his plate with mechanical precision. His shoulders were rigid, his jaw set in that familiar mask of defensive indifference she'd seen too many times. Good morning, she said, beginning to clear the sideboard. Morning. His voice was flat, dismissive. The boy from yesterday, the one who'd looked at her with wonder, was gone, replaced by the distant young man who barely acknowledged her existence. Grace felt the shift like a physical blow. She'd overstepped, gotten too close, forgotten her place. Mrs. Montgomery's words from her first day echoed in her memory. The staff who last longest here are the ones who remember they're meant to be invisible. I left Jerem's notebook on your nightstand, she said carefully. I saw it. Daniel didn't look up from his untouched breakfast. You can take it back. I don't think your method is going to work for someone like me. Someone like me. The phrase cut deeper than he intended, but Grace heard what he wasn't saying. Someone with too much privilege to deserve sympathy, too much money to justify failure. Someone who'd proven that all the advantages in the world couldn't fix what was broken inside him. I see. Grace's voice remained steady, professional. Of course, Mr. Daniel. The formal address stung. Yesterday she'd called him by his first name, had sat beside him like an equal. Now they were back to their assigned roles, the master's son and the help. The distance felt like a physical wall rising between them. Grace moved through her morning routine with mechanical precision, but her mind kept drifting to the notebook upstairs. Jerem's stories, his breakthrough moments, his dreams carefully preserved in fading ink. She'd never shared them with anyone, had kept them locked away like sacred relics. Yesterday felt like a mistake, a moment of weakness where grief and hope had clouded her judgment. Daniel spent the morning in his father's study, staring at corporate organizational charts and job descriptions for entry-level positions. Executive assistant, junior analyst, mailroom clerk, each title felt like another nail in the coffin of his potential. His phone rang. His father, calling from London. I trust you received my message about the position. Montgomery's voice crackled through the international connection. All business and disappointment. Yes, sir, good. I've also arranged for you to see Dr. Patricia Hendricks. She's a psychiatrist who specializes in learning disabilities. Perhaps medication can address what tutoring couldn't. Learning disabilities. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Not just stupid, not just lazy. Now he was defective, broken in ways that required pharmaceutical intervention. I don't think I need. What you need, Daniel, is to accept reality. You're 22 years old and can't pass a basic entrance exam. Either there's something medically wrong with you, or you're choosing to humiliate this family. I prefer to believe it's medical. The line went dead, leaving Daniel alone with the organizational charts and the crushing weight of his father's low expectations. He looked toward the window, where he could see Grace hanging laundry in the garden, her movements efficient and purposeful. She belonged somewhere in her work, in her quiet competence, in the memory of a son who'd proven worthy of her pride. Daniel belonged nowhere. That afternoon, Grace knocked on his door with fresh linens, the notebook tucked carefully in her apron. She'd decided to return it without comment, to retreat back into invisibility where she was safe. Come in, Daniel called, his voice hollow. She found him at his desk, surrounded by corporate paperwork and medical referral forms. The sight of him, young, brilliant, and utterly defeated, broke something loose in her chest. I brought your laundry, she said, setting the clean clothes on his dresser. Grace. Daniel's voice was quiet, almost apologetic. About yesterday, I didn't mean to waste your time, or to make you think I was something I'm not. Grace paused in her folding. What do you think you aren't? Smart enough, good enough, worth the effort. The words came out raw, unfiltered. My father's arranging a psychiatrist. Maybe drugs will fix whatever's wrong with my brain. Grace looked at the medical forms on his desk, at the career placement documents, at this brilliant young man who'd been convinced he was broken. She thought of Jerome in his final weeks, fighting cancer with the same stories that had gotten him into college, never losing faith in his own mind even when his body failed him. There's nothing wrong with your brain, she said quietly. Then why can't I pass a single test? I keep thinking about something you said earlier, Daniel said, stretching his cramped fingers. About Jerome believing everyone was fighting battles nobody could see. What was yours? Grace looked up from the practice test they'd been transforming into a story about competing kingdoms. My battle. You raised a son who got into UCLA while working multiple jobs and dealing with his illness. You've been invisible in this house for 8 years, watching my family waste opportunities Jerome would have killed for. That had to be its own kind of hard. Grace was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of Jerem's photo where it lay beside the notebook. Sometimes I thought God was playing a cruel joke, putting me in a house full of books my son would have loved, watching a brilliant boy destroy himself with fear while remembering another brilliant boy who never got the chance to be afraid of failing. Is that why you kept working here? Even when it hurt? Partially. But also Grace hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. I kept hoping that someday I might be able to help. That maybe Jerem's struggles wouldn't be meaningless if they could somehow save someone else. Daniel felt something shift in his chest, not the familiar weight of obligation, but something lighter. Purpose, maybe. You did help. You are helping, we'll see. You haven't taken a real test yet, but I want to now. That's different, isn't it? Grace laughed, a sound Daniel realized he'd never heard from her before, rich and warm and completely unguarded. It's everything, Daniel. Wanting to succeed is completely different from being afraid to fail. She pulled another practice test from the stack they'd been working through, but instead of handing it to him, she held it up to the light. Jerome used to say that tests were just conversations on paper. Someone asks you questions, you give them answers. The only difference between a test and talking is that you get to think before you respond. But what if I give the wrong answers? What if you give your answers? Grace countered. What if instead of trying to guess what they want to hear, you just respond honestly to what they're asking? Daniel took the test, but instead of the familiar dread, he felt something approaching curiosity. Would you stay while I try this one? If you want me to, I do. And Grace, if I start to shut down, if you see me disappearing into that place where I can't think, will you pull me back? How? Daniel thought about it. Remind me who I'm doing this for. Not my father, not the Montgomery legacy. For Jerome. For all the kids like him who deserve this chance. Grace nodded solemnly. That's a promise I can make. Daniel began the test, and for the first time in his academic life, the questions didn't feel like attacks. When he encountered a reading passage about environmental science, he imagined Jerome studying it, getting excited about the possibilities for helping people. When he hit a math problem that initially stumped him, he rewrote it as part of a story about building a bridge between two communities. Halfway through, he felt the familiar panic rising, the voice that whispered he was taking too long, making mistakes, proving his unworthiness. But Grace was there, her presence steady and calm. Breathe, she said quietly. Jerome's watching. Make him proud. The panic receded, replaced by something Daniel had never felt during a test before: peace. Not the absence of challenge, but the presence of support. The knowledge that regardless of his score, he wasn't alone in this room. When he finished, Daniel set down his pencil and looked at Grace. I don't know if I got them right, but I know I got them mine. Grace smiled, collecting the papers. That's all anyone can ask for. They scored it together, Grace reading the answer key while Daniel checked his responses. The result wasn't perfect. Daniel missed several questions, especially in the sections that required rapid calculation. But it was passing. Solidly, undeniably passing. I did it, Daniel whispered, staring at the score. I actually did it. You did it. Grace's voice was thick with emotion. Jerome would be so proud. Without thinking, Daniel stood and embraced her, the first spontaneous physical contact they'd ever shared. Grace stiffened for a moment, 8 years of professional boundaries warring with genuine affection, then relaxed into the hug. Thank you, Daniel said into her shoulder. For seeing something worth saving. For sharing Jerome with me. For believing I could be better than I believed myself. When they pulled apart, both of them were crying, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of connection, of purpose fulfilled, of potential finally recognized. Sometimes we need someone else to believe in us before we can believe in ourselves. Who has been that person in your life? Share their impact in the comments below. This is just the beginning, Grace said, wiping her eyes. One practice test in perfect conditions. The real thing will be harder, I know. But now I know I can do hard things. Daniel looked around the library, seeing it differently again, not as his father's shrine or Jerome's inspiration, but as the place where he'd finally found his own voice. And I won't be doing them alone. Grace began cleaning up their scattered papers, but she moved slowly, reluctant to end this moment. Your father will be calling tomorrow. The appointments, the medication consults, let him call. Daniel's voice was steady, sure in a way Grace had never heard from him. I have a different plan now. I'm going to take the SAT again. On my own terms, in my own way, with my own reasons, and if you fail, then I'll fail as myself instead of as someone else's disappointment. Jerome taught me that through you, the person you are when you're fighting for something you believe in is the only person worth being. As they gathered up Jerome's notebook and Daniel's stories, both of them felt the shift, not just in Daniel's confidence, but in their relationship. They were no longer employer and employee, or even teacher and student. They were something rarer and more precious. Two people who had found in each other the missing piece of their own stories. The helicopter's rotor wash scattered fallen leaves across the estate's restored driveway as Montgomery Sr. returned 3 days early from his European trip. Daniel heard it approaching from the library where he and Grace had been working through another practice test, his 4th consecutive passing score. "He's back," Daniel said, watching his father's silhouette emerge from the aircraft through the tall windows. Grace immediately began gathering the scattered papers, her movements quick and efficient. The easy intimacy of the past few days evaporated as professional boundaries reasserted themselves. "I should go." The afternoon cleaning routine. "Grace, wait." Daniel caught her arm gently. "We don't have to pretend this didn't happen. That you didn't save me." But Grace was already stepping away, the notebook clutched against her chest. "Your father will want to speak with you about the missed appointments." The library doors burst open with the force of Montgomery Sr.'s rage. He stood in the doorway, still wearing his travel clothes, his face flushed with the particular anger of a man accustomed to absolute control who'd found his commands ignored. 3 days, he said, his voice deadly quiet. 3 days of unreturned calls, missed appointments, and radio silence from my air. His eyes swept the room, taking in the scattered test papers, the notebook in Grace's hands, the guilty proximity between his son and the help. "What exactly has been going on here?" "Dad, I can explain. You missed your psychiatric evaluation. Dr. Hendricks called my assistant personally to express her concern about your mental state." Montgomery's gaze fixed on Grace, and something ugly flickered across his features. "I assume our staff has been accommodating during your breakdown?" The tone made Daniel's skin crawl, but Grace simply straightened her shoulders. "I should return to my duties, Mr. Montgomery." "Yes, you should." Montgomery stepped aside just enough to let her pass, his presence looming and intimidating. "And Grace, in the future, remember that your job description doesn't include counseling my son." Grace paused at the doorway, and for a moment Daniel thought she might turn back, might defend what they'd built together. Instead, she simply nodded. "Of course, sir." The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like abandonment. "Sit down." Montgomery moved to his desk, assuming the position of authority he'd held since Daniel was old enough to disappoint him. Dr. Whitfield's report was even worse than I expected. Complete failure to engage, signs of dissociative behavior, possible learning disabilities requiring medication. "I don't need medication," Daniel said quietly. "What you need is irrelevant. What the Montgomery name requires is that its heir be functional in society." Montgomery pulled out a folder thick with documents. "I've arranged a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, cognitive testing, and a pharmaceutical consultation. Whatever's wrong with your brain, we're going to fix it." By evening, the storm had passed, leaving the estate eerily quiet except for the steady drip of water from damaged gutters. The power remained out, and Grace had lit candles throughout the main rooms, their warm glow transforming the formal spaces into something almost cozy. Daniel found her in the library, sitting in his father's leather chair with a photo album open across her lap. She looked smaller in the enormous chair, vulnerable in a way he'd never seen before. "I'm sorry," he said, starting to back away. "I didn't mean to intrude." "It's all right." Grace's voice was soft, distant. "I was just remembering." Daniel approached slowly, seeing the photographs illuminated by candlelight, a young boy with Grace's eyes and an infectious smile, captured in moments of ordinary joy. Birthday parties in a modest apartment, graduation from elementary school, proudly displaying a science fair trophy. "That's Jerome," Grace said unnecessarily, her finger tracing the edge of a photo where the boy wore a hospital gown but still managed to grin at the camera. 2 weeks before he died. He'd just finished his college application essay. Daniel sat in the chair across from her, the formal distance of employer and employee dissolved in the intimate lighting. "What did he write about?" Grace turned the page, revealing a folded paper tucked behind a photo. "He wrote about this room, actually. About coming here with me during those first few months when I was still learning the job." Daniel looked around the library with new eyes. His father's sanctuary, filled with first edition volumes and awards from various business organizations. Jerome would have been 14 then, the same age Daniel had been when Grace started working here. Mr. Montgomery didn't mind. He wasn't home much in those days. Building the Singapore office, Grace's voice carried no judgment, just fact. Jerome would sit right where you're sitting now, working on homework while I cleaned. He'd never seen so many books in one place. She unfolded the essay carefully, the paper worn soft from handling. He wrote about the weight of books, not physical weight, but the weight of knowledge, of possibilities. How being in this room made him feel like he could reach into any future he wanted. Daniel felt something twist in his chest. This room had always felt like a monument to his inadequacy, every leather-bound spine a reminder of intellectual achievements he'd never match. But Jerome had seen potential here, had found inspiration in the same space that had crushed Daniel's confidence. "May I read it?" Daniel asked. Grace hesitated, then handed him the pages. Daniel read slowly, Jerome's voice emerging from the careful handwriting articulate, passionate, alive with curiosity. The essay transformed the Montgomery Library into a temple of learning. A sanctuary where a boy from East LA could dream of becoming a doctor. Where knowledge wasn't about privilege but about possibility. "This is extraordinary," Daniel whispered. "The way he writes about books like they're living things, about how each one contains someone's entire world." UCLA thought so too. Grace's voice was barely audible. "He got the acceptance letter the day after the leukemia came back." Daniel looked up from the essay to find tears streaming down Grace's face. Her composure finally cracking after 8 years of professional restraint. In the candlelight, she looked ancient and young at the same time, weighted down by loss but still fierce with maternal pride. "Grace, I'm so sorry. I had no idea he never got to go." The words came out raw, unfiltered. For years of perfect grades, working 2 jobs to help with expenses, dreaming about medical school, about helping kids like him. And he never got to walk across a stage, never got to wear a cap and gown. Never got to prove to everyone who doubted him that he belonged. Daniel set the essay aside and moved to kneel beside her chair. A gesture that would have scandalized his mother but felt entirely natural in this moment. "He did prove it. He proved it to you, to himself. That has to count for something." Grace looked at him through her tears, seeing something in his face that surprised her. "You understand, don't you? About carrying dreams that aren't entirely your own." "Yes." Daniel's voice was thick. "Except Jerome's dreams were his choice. Mine were just inherited, like everything else." Grace wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Maybe that's why I showed you his notebook. You're both carrying the weight of other people's expectations, but from opposite directions. He had to prove he deserved a chance. You have to prove you deserve the chances you were given." Daniel sat back on his heels, the parallel hitting him like a physical blow. "That's why the tests feel impossible. It's not about getting the right answers, it's about proving I'm worthy of advantages I never asked for. And every time you fail, you confirm what some part of you believes, that you don't deserve what you have." The candles flickered in a draft from somewhere, casting shifting shadows across the library walls. In the unstable light, the room felt different, less like his father's shrine to achievement and more like a space where 2 people could finally tell the truth about their fears. "Jerome's essay mentions you," Daniel said, returning to the pages. "Listen to this. My mother cleans houses for rich people, but she taught me that knowledge doesn't belong to anyone. Books don't care if you own them or just borrow them, they share their secrets with anyone willing to pay attention." Grace smiled through fresh tears. "He was always trying to make me sound wiser than I was. Maybe he just saw what everyone else missed." Daniel looked around the library again, seeing it through Jerome's eyes, not as a display of wealth but as a repository of human understanding. "Like you saw something in me that the tutors missed." "What did I see?" Daniel met her gaze directly. "Someone worth saving." The phrase hung between them, simple but profound. In the candlelit library, surrounded by books that had witnessed generations of Montgomery achievements, a billionaire's son and a maid found themselves connected by something deeper than their circumstances, the shared understanding of what it meant to carry dreams too heavy for one person to bear alone. "What dreams have you carried for other people? And which ones have you carried for yourself? Sometimes we need to separate the two to find our real path. Tell us about your experience in the comments." Grace closed the photo album but left Jerome's essay on the table between them. "He would have liked you, you know. Jerome always believed that everyone was fighting some battle nobody else could see. I think I would have liked him too." Daniel touched the edge of the essay. And I think he would have wanted me to figure out how to pass those tests. Not for my father, not for the Montgomery name, but for all the kids like him who don't get second chances. Outside, they could hear the distant sound of chainsaws as emergency crews finally reached their neighborhood. The outside world was coming back with all its demands and expectations and opportunities for failure. But in the library, surrounded by the weight of books and the lighter burden of shared understanding, Daniel and Grace had found something neither had expected a reason to keep trying, that had nothing to do with proving themselves worthy and everything to do with honoring the dreams of a boy who'd never gotten the chance to fulfill his own. The power returned just after midnight, fluorescent lights buzzing to life throughout the mansion and breaking the intimate spell of candlelight. But Daniel and Grace remained in the library, now hunched over the massive oak table with Jerem's notebook open between them and pages of Daniel's writing scattered around like fallen leaves. "Tell me about the mirror prints again," Grace said, adjusting her reading glasses the first time Daniel had seen her acknowledge she needed them. "But this time, don't make him a victim of the mirrors. Make him the one who breaks them." Daniel picked up his pen, the words flowing easier now after hours of practice. The prince realized that the mirrors weren't showing him his failures, they were showing him his fears. And fears, unlike failures, could be faced better. But why does he need to break them? What if he just stopped looking? Because other people live in that castle too. His breaking the mirrors might free them as well. Grace smiled, the expression transforming her face. "Now you're thinking like Jerome. Make it bigger than just one person's struggle." They'd been working this way for hours, Grace asking questions that pushed Daniel's stories deeper. Daniel discovering that his mind worked best when it had narrative stakes to grab onto. The set reading comprehension passages weren't just boring texts anymore. They were letters from one character to another, historical documents that revealed family secrets, scientific reports about fictional worlds. Daniel looked at the folder, seeing his future mapped out in clinical terms: diagnoses, prescriptions, managed expectations. A lifetime of being a problem to be solved rather than a person to be understood. What if there's nothing wrong with my brain? Montgomery's laugh was harsh. Then explain 8 years of failure. Explain missing every college entrance exam. Explain being outperformed by teenagers with half your advantages. Maybe I learned differently, maybe you're making excuses. Montgomery's voice rose. "Do you have any idea what it's like having business associates ask about your son's college plans? What it's like explaining that the heir to Montgomery Industries can't pass a basic entrance exam?" The familiar shame washed over Daniel, but this time it felt different, not like truth, but like manipulation. Grace's voice echoed in his memory. "You're both carrying the weight of other people's expectations, but from opposite directions." "I took some practice tests," Daniel said carefully. "I passed them." "Practice tests?" Montgomery's tone dripped condescension. "Anyone can pass practice tests. The real thing is different. There's pressure, stakes, consequences for failure. You've proven repeatedly that you can't handle that kind of stress. Because I was trying to be someone I'm not, you were trying to be a Montgomery." Montgomery slammed his hand on the desk. "You were trying to live up to a name that means something in this world, to you. It means something to you." The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Montgomery's face went white, then red. "I see what's happened here," he said slowly. 3 days alone with the help, filling your head with nonsense about being misunderstood, about learning differently. Let me be clear, Daniel Grace Williams is an employee, a maid. Her job is to clean toilets, not to play therapist to my son. She helped me, she helped you avoid reality. Montgomery stood, towering over his son. She told you what you wanted to hear instead of what you needed to know. That's not help, that's enabling. Daniel felt something crack inside his chest. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about. I know that woman lost a son and is projecting her grief onto you. I know she's convinced you that your failures are somehow noble. That your inability to perform is actually a sign of sensitivity or creativity or some other ridiculous notion. Jerome got into UCLA. Jerome is dead. Montgomery's voice cut through the room like a blade. Whatever potential he had died with him, and using a dead boy to justify your own inadequacy is pathetic even by your standards. The words hit Daniel like physical blows. In the silence that followed, he could hear his own heartbeat, could feel 8 years of carefully constructed defenses crumbling. "Grace is fired," Montgomery continued, his voice now coldly professional. "Effective immediately. I won't have my son's recovery sabotaged by someone who can't maintain appropriate boundaries. You can't fire her for helping me. I can fire her for overstepping her role, for interfering with medical treatment, and for encouraging delusions that are harmful to your development." Montgomery moved to the window, his decision final. "She'll be gone by morning. And you'll be at Dr. Hendrick's office tomorrow afternoon for a complete psychological workup." Daniel stared at his father's back, feeling the weight of ultimatums and threatened consequences. Grace would lose her job, her livelihood, her stability, possibly her ability to honor Jerem's memory. All because she'd seen something worth saving in a broken boy and dared to act on it. "I'm sorry," Daniel whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was apologizing to his father, to Grace, or to Jerem's memory. Montgomery didn't turn around. "You will be, but you'll also be fixed, medicated if necessary, and eventually functional enough to represent this family's interests. That's what matters." As Daniel left the library, he felt the fragile confidence of the past few days crumble into dust. The test scores, the stories, the moment of connection with Grace, all of it suddenly felt like delusion, like the fantasy of a broken mind desperate to believe it could be whole. By morning, Grace would be gone. The notebook would go with her. And Daniel would be alone again with his failures, his fears, and the crushing certainty that some people were simply born to disappoint everyone who ever believed in them. Daniel didn't sleep. He sat by his bedroom window, watching the pre-dawn darkness and replaying his father's words on an endless, tortuous loop. "Jerome is dead. Using a dead boy to justify your own inadequacy is pathetic." Each repetition felt like a fresh wound, confirming every fear he'd ever had about himself. At 5:30, he heard movement in the servants' quarters, Grace packing her belongings, preparing to disappear from his life as quietly as she'd entered it 8 years ago. The sound of drawers closing and boxes being sealed carried through the morning air like a funeral dirge. By 6, Daniel was dressed and standing outside Grace's small apartment above the garage, his hand raised to knock but frozen by the weight of what he'd cost her. Through the thin door, he could hear her moving around, the efficient sounds of someone who'd learned to pat quickly, to start over without ceremony. He knocked anyway. "It's open," Grace's voice called, flat and professional. Daniel entered to find her small living space transformed into a collection of boxes and suitcases. 8 years of life at the Montgomery estate reduced to portable containers. Grace stood with her back to him, folding clothes with mechanical precision. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, the words inadequate and hollow. "For what?" Grace didn't turn around. "You didn't do anything wrong. I got you fired. I destroyed your life because I was too weak to stand up to him." Grace paused in her folding, her shoulders tense. "Your father was right about one thing. I overstepped. I let my grief about Jerome cloud my judgment about appropriate boundaries." "Don't say that." Daniel moved closer, desperate to bridge the distance she was creating between them. "What you did, what we did, it mattered. I can pass those tests now. I found my voice." "Practice tests, Daniel. In perfect conditions, with someone cheering you on." Grace finally turned, and Daniel saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of dreams deferred once again. "The real world doesn't work that way." "Then let me prove it. Let me take the actual SAT and show everyone what? That the billionaire's son finally learned to succeed. That's not exactly a miracle." Grace's voice was bitter, edged with pain. "Your father was right about something else too. I was projecting. Seeing Jerome in you, trying to give him the chance he never got." Daniel felt something break inside his chest. "So none of it was real. You never actually believed in me." Grace looked at him for a long moment, and he saw her internal struggle, the battle between honesty and kindness, between protecting herself and protecting him. "It doesn't matter what I believed," she said finally. "You have to believe in yourself now." She handed him Jerem's notebook, and Daniel noticed her hands were shaking slightly. "Take this. Maybe the stories will still help, even without me there to guide you through them." Daniel stared at the notebook, feeling its weight. "I can't. This belongs with you. It's all you have left of him." Jerome would want it to help someone who needed it. Grace pressed the notebook into his hands. That's who he was, always trying to save everyone else, even when he couldn't save himself. The parallel hit Daniel like a physical blow. Jerome trying to save everyone, Grace trying to save Daniel, Daniel unable to save Grace from the consequences of her kindness. A chain of people trying to lift each other up and failing, each failure creating another person in need of saving. What will you do? Daniel asked. Find another job. There are plenty of houses in Beverly Hills that need cleaning. Grace's voice was steady, but Daniel caught the slight tremor underneath. At 57, starting over wouldn't be easy. Grace, I don't. Grace held up a hand, stopping him. Don't make this harder than it has to be. You have a choice to make now, Daniel. You can let this break you, or you can use it to become who you're supposed to be. But you have to make that choice for yourself, not for me, not for Jerome, not even to spite your father. Daniel felt the weight of the notebook in his hands. Felt the weight of possibility and responsibility. What if I fail? Then you fail as yourself. That's all. Jerome ever wanted, the chance to fail or succeed as who he really was, not as what other people expected him to be. Grace moved to her suitcase, the conversation clearly over in her mind. But Daniel couldn't leave, couldn't accept that this was how their story ended, with her sacrificing herself for his growth, with him too weak to protect the person who'd saved him. I could talk to him, Daniel said desperately. I could tell him it was my idea, that I convinced you to help me, and prove to him that you're exactly as weak as he thinks you are. Grace shook her head. No, Daniel. This is your test now. Not multiple choice, not something you can rewrite as a story. This is real life, and real life requires you to decide who you want to be when everything is on the line. A car horn honked outside Grace's ride to the bus station, another chapter ending with quiet dignity and private grief. Grace picked up her suitcase, but paused at the door. There's something I never told you about Jerome's last day. The cancer had spread to his brain by then, and he was mostly unconscious. But in his final hour, he opened his eyes and looked right at me. Her voice broke slightly, the first crack in her composed facade. He said, Mama, I figured out the real secret. The test isn't about getting the right answers. It's about becoming the right person. Then he smiled. And he was gone. Grace looked directly at Daniel. And he saw Jerome's eyes in hers, the same intelligence, the same fierce hope, the same belief that tomorrow could be different from today. Become the right person, Daniel. That's the only test that really matters. The door closed behind her with gentle finality, leaving Daniel alone with Jerome's notebook and the most important choice of his life. Outside, he heard the car drive away, carrying Grace toward an uncertain future while he stood frozen between his father's expectations and his own potential. Sometimes the people who change our lives have to leave for us to fully step into who we're meant to be. Have you experienced this kind of transformative goodbye? Share your story in the comments. The house felt different without Grace, emptier, colder, more like the monument to achievement it had always been and less like the home it had briefly become. But Jerome's notebook remained warm in Daniel's hands, filled with stories about boys who chose courage over comfort, who decided that becoming themselves was worth any price. Daniel had a choice to make. He could let his father medicate him into compliance, could accept the role of managed disappointment, could live forever as someone else's definition of functional, or he could honor Grace's sacrifice and Jerome's memory by becoming exactly who he was supposed to be, not despite his differences, but because of them. The SAT registration deadline was tomorrow. Dr. Hendrick's appointment was this afternoon. Time to choose. Waiting for your approval to continue to Act 9. Act 9, resolution. Word count, 1,056 weeks later. Daniel sat in the same testing center where he'd failed so many times before, but everything was different now. In his pocket, he carried a folded piece of paper, not Jerome's notebook, which remained safely on his desk at home, but a single page he'd written the night before. The story of a prince who learned that mirrors only have power when you're looking for someone else's reflection. The proctor called time to begin, and Daniel opened his test booklet with steady hands. Instead of the familiar panic, he felt something he'd never experienced before during an exam: curiosity about his own capabilities, excitement about the conversation he was about to have on paper. The reading passages weren't obstacles anymore. They were stories waiting to be understood. The math problems weren't judgments on his worth. They were puzzles that wanted to be solved. When anxiety tried to creep in during the more challenging sections, Daniel touched the paper in his pocket and remembered Grace's voice. The test isn't about getting the right answers. It's about becoming the right person. 3 hours later, Daniel walked out of the testing center knowing he'd given his authentic best effort. Not perfect, but his. The results wouldn't arrive for weeks, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of them. The confrontation with his father had been brutal. When Daniel refused the psychiatric evaluation and announced his intention to retake the SAT, Montgomery Sr. had threatened to cut him off financially, to disown him entirely if he continued this delusional rebellion. Then disown me, Daniel had said quietly, surprised by his own calm. But I'm taking the test as myself, not as your project to be fixed. Montgomery had raged, pleaded, and finally retreated into cold silence. But he hadn't followed through on his threats, perhaps recognizing that disowning his only heir would be a public admission of failure that the Montgomery name couldn't survive. Now, -1 weeks after Grace's departure, Daniel found himself in an unexpected place, Dr. Patricia Hendrick's office, not as a patient seeking medication, but as someone requesting a professional opinion about learning differences. Your test results are fascinating, Dr. Hendrick said, reviewing the comprehensive battery Daniel had voluntarily undergone. You show classic markers of what we used to call test anxiety, but it's more complex than that. Your brain processes information in highly narrative patterns. You literally think in stories. Is that bad? It's different. And difference, especially in academic settings, is often pathologized instead of understood. Dr. Hendricks leaned forward. The traditional educational system is designed for linear, compartmentalized thinking. Your mind is integrative, holistic. You need context and meaning to access your full intellectual capacity. Daniel thought of Jerem's notebook, of stories that transformed dry facts into living narratives. So I'm not broken. You're beautifully, brilliantly human. The broken part was trying to force yourself into a system that wasn't designed for how your mind works. That afternoon, Daniel drove to East LA, following an address he'd found in Jerem's college application materials. The neighborhood was worlds away from Beverly Hills chain-link fences instead of hedges, small apartment buildings instead of mansions, corner stores instead of boutiques. He found Grace at her sister's apartment, helping her nephew with homework at a kitchen table covered with textbooks and dreams. She looked up when Daniel knocked, surprise and something else, hope, flickering across her face. Daniel, what are you doing here? I took the test. He pulled an envelope from his jacket, the official SAT scores that had arrived that morning. I wanted you to be the first to know. Grace's hands trembled as she opened the envelope, her eyes scanning the numbers. A smile spread across her face, transforming her features. 1420. Daniel, this is college ready. More than college ready. Daniel sat across from her at the small table, the space intimate in a way his father's mansion had never been. But that's not why I'm here. Grace waited, her nephew looking between them with curious eyes. I'm starting a tutoring program. For kids like Jerome, like me, kids who learn differently but just need someone to see their potential. Daniel pulled out another set of papers. I want you to run it. Not as a maid, not as an employee, but as a partner. The Jerome Williams Learning Center. Grace stared at the documents, incorporation papers, funding commitments, a mission statement about honoring different kinds of intelligence. Daniel, I can't. I'm not qualified to. You're the most qualified person I know. You saw what everyone else missed. You saved a life that everyone else had given up on. Daniel leaned forward. Jerome never got to help the kids he wanted to help, but maybe we can help them for him. Tears streamed down Grace's face as she read the mission statement, seeing Jerome's dreams given new life in unexpected hands. The funding, how did you trust fund my grandmother left me? Turns out being a Montgomery disappointment has some advantages. Dad never bothered to control that money. Daniel smiled. Jerome's going to help a lot of kids, Grace, starting with the ones who need to know that different isn't broken. Grace's nephew looked up from his homework. Are you really going to help kids like me? Kids who think weird. Daniel knelt beside the boy's chair, seeing himself at that age, seeing Jerome. Seeing all the children who'd been told their minds were wrong instead of wonderful. Especially kids who think weird, Daniel said. Because weird thinking is just thinking that hasn't found its place yet. 6 months later, the Jerome Williams Learning Center opened in a converted warehouse, its walls covered with stories written by students who'd learned to see their differences as gifts. Grace ran the day-to-day operations with the same quiet competence she'd brought to everything else. But now her wisdom was recognized, celebrated. Essential. Daniel taught the older students, sharing Jerome's techniques for transforming abstract concepts into living narratives. He watched teenagers who'd been labeled learning disabled discover that their minds were simply designed for deeper kinds of understanding. On the anniversary of Jerome's death, Daniel and Grace stood in the center's main room, surrounded by student artwork and achievement certificates. Testimonials from kids who'd found their voices and parents who'd found hope. "He would have loved this," Grace said, touching the plaque by the entrance. "Jerome Williams, who taught us that every mind has its own way of shining. He did love this," Daniel replied. "Through you. Through the notebook. Through every kid we help realize they're not broken." He paused, looking around at the bustling center. "Grace, do you remember what you asked me that first day? Whether I was hopeless?" Grace smiled, the same expression that had transformed her face in the Montgomery Library. "I remember your answer too. You said you didn't know anymore. Well, now I know." Daniel opened Jerome's notebook, its pages filled with new stories written by new voices. Jerome's original words now joined by dozens of others who'd learned to see their struggles as the beginning of their strength. Hope isn't something you have or don't have. It's something you create, one story at a time. The late afternoon sun streamed through the center's windows, illuminating the faces of students discovering their potential, casting light on dreams that refuse to die, warming the space where a billionaire's son and a maid had learned that the most important lessons can't be purchased, they can only be shared. Story by story, heart to heart, one transformed life at a time. In the margin of the notebook's last page, Jerome had written, "The real test is whether you become someone worth becoming." Looking around the center that bore his name, watching students who'd been written off by the world discover their own worth, Daniel knew they'd all passed the test together. Some stories end with graduation ceremonies or acceptance letters. This one ended with something rarer, the knowledge that every ending is just another beginning in disguise. And every person carries within them the power to rewrite not just their own story, but the stories of everyone whose life they choose to touch.
Thank you for watching to the end. I believe you enjoyed it. We have a lot of other interesting stories like this lined up for you already. So click the image showing on your screen to watch the next. Don't forget to subscribe.